Hello, R.C. Morton here. Today I want to talk about this during this video log. Oh, wait a minute. That's a Blackbird, literally the avian type. But I want to talk about this Blackbird, the SR-71 Strategic Reconnaissance Aircraft. The SR-71 was not armed, it was not a fighter, it was not an interceptor. It was designed and built for one purpose only, and that was for reconnaissance. The Blackbird was developed mostly from the genius of this fellow by the name of Kelly Johnson, who was an engineer for Lockheed, and he worked in a department called the Skunk Works. And the development of the Blackbird was what they called a black project, which is a top secret, highly classified project. And a black project was generally not acknowledged by the government or anybody else who was involved. And interestingly enough, the Blackbird, as sophisticated of an aircraft as it turned out to be, was not designed with the help of computers. It was all done with slide rules. Now, the SR-71 was first flown in 1964, and it came into operational use in 1966. It was actually developed from its predecessor, the A-12 reconnaissance aircraft, which first flew in 1962 and went into operational use in 67, but was immediately retired the next year in 68. And there were a total of 15 of these A-12s built, and they were used by the CIA. There were 6 A-12s lost due to crashes, so the other 9 remaining are around the country on display at various museums. But the SR-71 was a variant of the A-12, and it was a few feet longer, and it could carry a heavier fuel load and could carry a heavier camera. There were a total of 32 of the SR-71 Blackbirds built, and there's 20 remaining today, and they are also on display around the country in various museums. The SR-71 had 2 retirements. The first retirement came in 1988. It lasted about a year, and then it went back into service, and it was utilized until 1998 and retired by the Air Force at that point, although NASA continued to operate the one they had for another year. Interestingly enough, the Blackbird has had numerous missiles fired at it over its operational life, and none were ever hit. Because of its high Mach number and the fact that it flew so high, it could simply outrun any missile, so none were ever lost due to adversarial action. Because of the Blackbird's high speed and because of the resultant heat generated by the drag, the Blackbird experienced high exterior temperatures. It was so high that even the windshield actually was made out of quartz, and the windshield would get up to around 600 degrees. There were areas of the aircraft that actually got much higher than that 600 degrees, and with these high exterior temperatures, they had to use titanium because titanium was capable of withstanding these high temperatures. And an interesting aside to the development of the SR-71 is that Russia had most of the titanium production in the world. And so the US government formed these shell companies which were able to purchase this titanium from Russia, and we used them to build the SR-71, which ironically was then turned around to spy on Russia. These high external temperatures weren't the only problems faced with the development of the SR-71. Another major accomplishment was the development of the engines that powered the aircraft. The Blackbird was fitted with two J58 turbo ramjet engines. And this was an extremely unique engine that supplied turbojet power up to about Mach 1.8 to Mach 2.2. And then airflow was bypassed through ducts, bypassed the core of the engine and fed into the rear of the engine, and then supplied fuel for the ramjet. So the aircraft essentially was a turbojet, and then at higher speeds became a ramjet. And the ramjet actually provided 80% of the thrust at the higher Mach speeds. Now, the engines were not without their problems when they came about. Because of some of the unique characteristics of the aircraft and the engines, the pilots had to be highly skilled. And one of the major problems was that the engine had a spike, looked like a cone in the engine, in the front of the engine, that could actually move forward and aft about 26 inches. And the purpose of being able to move the cone was to keep the supersonic flow within the confines of the engine inlets. And if it escaped the inlet, it was called an unstart. The ramjet would fail to produce thrust. The turbojet would continue to run. So it still had some thrust, but about 80% of it was lost during an unstart. And these things happened often without apparent rhyme or reason. And because of the amount of thrust lost off one side of the aircraft, the aircraft would experience an enormous amount of asymmetrical thrust. And if the pilot didn't immediately reduce thrust on the running engine, on the normal engine, and put in the correct control inputs, then the aircraft could be lost. It would just be uncontrollable. And as time went on, they developed some computer assistants that would keep these unstarts from happening quite so frequently. And in fact, they became quite rare near the end of the operational life of the SR-71. Now, there are a lot of facts about the Blackbird that I find interesting and that you might also. Because of its high skin temperature, it had to have a particular type of jet fuel developed that had a lower volatility or flash point than the standard jet fuel. And it was called JP7. And the fuel tanks in the Blackbird were not bladders like they are in a lot of and most other aircraft. They were just, the aircraft was just held within the confines of the structure of the aircraft, and there was sealant put in there to keep it from leaking, which never really worked out very well. And the aircraft tended to leak a lot of fuel on the ground and even leaked a little in flight. And when it heated up, it would get substantially less. So on the ground, some of the ground crew actually wore rain jackets underneath the thing to keep the fuel from dripping on them. But once it got up to altitude and up to speed, most of that leaking stopped. They never really solved that with the sealant. It was just kind of an accepted thing. Because of the heat generated, the aircraft actually, it was reported that it got 3 to 4 inches longer as it heated up. And this would be at the higher Mach speeds, close to its max Mach speed, which was more than Mach 3. The other unique thing, the aircraft could be equipped with 3 different nose cones that could be changed out really quite easily. there were only 4 bolts holding on the nose cone. Mostly the nose cone was held on by the air pressure in flight. But the 3 options that it had would be the nose could have radar. The one nose cone could have radar. Another nose cone could have the optical bar camera, or it could be empty with just some weights for training purposes. And because of the other unique thing about the Blackbird, because it flew at 85,000 plus feet, if there was an explosive decompression or any decompression, or if the pilots had to eject from the aircraft, they would be in grave danger without essentially a spacesuit, and that is exactly what they wore. Now, the fuel aboard the aircraft was limited on takeoff to about a half a load. And that was because with a full load, it put excessive stress on the tires. And then after liftoff, if they had an engine failure, it would be dicey to control it. So it was typically launched with a half load of fuel. It would then climb up to an altitude to meet a tanker, and then it would take on its full fuel load. And the usual missions that the SR-71 Blackbird flew were about 2.5 to 4.5 hours. But some missions lasted 10 hours. And of course, that long, that would involve multiple air refuelings, which meant the aircraft would have to slow down and descend down to the altitude to meet up with a tanker to take on more JP-7. Now lastly, I'd like to talk about the numbers about the Blackbird. Liftoff speed was around 240 miles an hour. Landing speed was about 175 miles an hour. It held 80,200 pounds of fuel, which in round numbers is about 12,000 gallons. And the aircraft could go 2,500 plus miles an hour. Now the camera on board, which was quite unique, could actually survey 100,000 square miles of the Earth each hour. And on its retirement flight, this thing actually set a speed record. It flew from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. in 1 hour and 4 minutes. I would argue that the SR-71 Blackbird is probably the most amazing aircraft ever built, and maybe the most amazing aircraft that ever will be built. And we're lucky enough out at the March Airfield Museum to have this beautiful SR-71 on display inside our Hangar 1. You can see it as soon as you walk in the door. And I would recommend that you come out and pay it a visit sometime and take a look at this unique aircraft. Thanks.